Quentin, if there's any two subjects that have fascinated human beings and perplexed philosophers, it's God and time. What happens when you put them together and ask, did God create time?
I think when you put them together, you get a clear logical contradiction, and because there are only two alternatives. Either God exists in time, in which case God can't create time without creating himself. It can be a self-caused cause. Or else God does not exist in time and is timeless. But in that case, God cannot create time because his creative act that creates the beginning of time is going to exist at the first moment of time, which makes God exist in time.
Which is contradictory.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that the question is inherently meaningless.
Oh, I'd say it's inherently self-contradictory.
And therefore, would you then conclude that since we know that time exists, or some people say it's an illusion, but we have this expression of time, so we know that time exists and the two are inconsistent, are you saying that therefore you can conclude that God doesn't exist, or the kind of God, because you only have these two alternatives?
Oh, yes, clearly. Yes, it's obvious that time exists, and I think it's at least as obvious that God doesn't exist.
Is that required? I mean, that seems like a very radical concept that you're explaining very simply.
It only seems radical because the number of people who believe in God, and they would want some more wishy-washy conclusion. But that's just because of the culture we live in. If we follow the scientists, the 93% of the top scientists are atheists, then they wouldn't regard it as radical at all.
I think that's an interesting fact, but I wouldn't. I think that could be analyzed in a lot of different ways.
Okay, well, I'll put it this way.
Let's look at the hardcore metaphysics, and let's analyze both points of view that you said. You said that there's only two possibilities. God can be either in time or not in time. Seems to be correct. Some people might say he kind of oscillates between the two and chooses one or the other. It gets more murky. But if God is in time, let's explain what that would entail.
If God is in time, then either he doesn't create time. But if God is in time and creates time, then God is creating himself, because he's creating the first instant, which includes everything in it, and that means God is creating himself. And theists admit that a self-caused God is a contradiction. And the second possibility is that God is timeless. God's creation of time, the act of creation, exists in time because it exists at the first moment of time, which is inconsistent with God not being in time.
Well, there are arguments on the first in terms of God being in time. One of them would be that time is sort of one of God's properties, that it's a property of God that emerges from God, that is something that he creates and then chooses to be in.
Well, if God has a property of being in time and he creates that property, then he's still creating himself. He's still creating what is his self, his nature, as the property of being in time. So still the contradiction of a self-created being.
All right, let me take the other view, that if God is not in time, the view is that in this one timeless moment, that God is able to really do everything that involves time and all history in this block universe, that every event in time is fixed, and God, being outside of time, can control this whole process.
Well, if God's controlling it and creating it, God would control and create every state of this universe.
Well, it's in one timeless moment that God does the whole thing.
That doesn't make sense, because if God created something in a timeless moment, what he created would have to be timeless. If God created a block universe, which has successive stages, then God would have to create each successive stage.
Well, it's not a successive stage, because when you look at a block universe from outside time, It's like the way we would look at a three-dimensional cube. We see the whole thing, it's there in one of our moments. So God being outside of time, one of God's moments, this timeless moment, has this block universe that has every moment in space and time fixed.
Well, the point is, if everything is still fixed, the point is the universe, even if conceived the way you do, has relationships of one state is later than another. And if God creates each state, which he's defined as doing, God creates each state of the universe, each part of the universe, then that act of creation brings God into the time of these successive states.
Well, there is an act, theoretically as it is at this timeless moment, but the act is not a sequence of act. It's one bloop. It's like a pardon the analogy, a plastic extruder plopping a thing out at one moment, and it has three-dimensional structure. In our world, in God's world, it has a four-dimensional structure.
I think that's problematic, because if God did something like that, that whole world would exist only for an instant. And
An instant of God's time, but it would have its own time as we experience it in our world. But in God's world, it would indeed be an instant.
Well, that seems to be a contradiction, because you have one and the same thing being time, and at the same time, it's an instant.
Indeed, most of the conversation one has about God and time does seem like a contradiction, and therefore I think it's exciting to explore, because it reflects upon what the nature of God is, and indeed whether God exists or not. Let me take another view. Another view says that there's something called God's time, and God's time is different than our time, that God lives in God time, and he created, world time. We live in world time, God lives in God time, and we don't understand quite what that is, but it's different.
If God created world time, then his creative act would itself exist in the world time by virtue of creating it.
Well, it would be at the beginning of world time, because God created it, but it would be in some time in God's time. But God has his own conception of time and sequence of events. There's a before and after in God's time, maybe, but God has his own existence in time, but it's God's time. He created world time at an instant at which time it created, and then world time just continued.
Well, that would mean that God just created the first state of the universe and let the rest of the universe evolve by itself, which is called deism. But contemporary theists don't hold that view. They claim that each state of the universe is caused by God. It's called continuous creation.
Sure, and I think there are people who believe that God created it and then went away, the deists. There are people there are theists who believe that God is just sustaining the universe and never created it in the first place. And then perhaps the majority believe that God both created and sustained it. All that true, but that initial act of creation could have been the creation of this time that we experience, which I'm calling world time, but God and his existence exists in another plane, an analogous plane, which I'm calling God time.
If God's creative act either creates just the first state, call it T1, and the second state, call it T2, that's later than T1.
In world time.
In world time, and that means that God's creative act, which is sustaining time T1 in existence, that can only do so at T1. It exists in T1. So
Okay.
God then exists in world time. And the alternative is that God creates every state in world time, so God's creative acts successively exist at T1, T2, T3, T4, because God creates each of those.
Yeah, and that may be the case, or some people argue that. I'm not sure that's a necessary argument. I think another argument is that God created at T1, and there's the natural progression. God doesn't have to continuously sustain it. Maybe he has to, maybe he doesn't. I don't think that's necessarily forces the argument about what time is. If he continues to sustain it or doesn't need to, I don't think it matters at that point. I do know this gives me a headache to
Okay,
think
well,
about it.
the mere fact that God created the first state, call it T1, and T1 is earlier than the second state, call it T2,
Yes.
means that God's creating T1 is earlier than the existence of T2.
Yes.
And that brings God's creative act into world time, because by creating and holding in existence T1, it's earlier than the state T2. So God's act of creation exists at T1
Okay.
in world time.
Okay. But what follows from that?
It follows that God cannot create time from, you're supposing this other time that God exists in.
Yes.
It means that God cannot create world time while remaining solely in this other time. God has to enter world time to create it, because his creative volition exists at least at the very first state, time T1, and that makes God exist in world time.
And in that process, I think I agree with what you're saying, but I don't find the conclusion that there's a therefore that God, there's a logical contradiction here. Where's the contradiction?
The contradiction is that God's creative act exists at one time in God time, and at another time in the world time.
Yes.
And there are different times, and so you have one and the same thing existing at different times,
Yeah.
which is a contradiction.
Different kinds of times, not different. It's not the same event in the same kind of time. It's two kinds of time that are very different. So you're categorizing it in world time in one way and categorizing it in God time in another way. I don't know if any of this is right. It does give me a headache, but I think it is fascinating to explore it. There's a richness to understanding what you mean. So if you're a theist, I think you should be thinking about these questions, because maybe there is some logical contradictions in the way you pose things. Maybe you have to reconstruct the way you think about God. And if you're not a theist and you reject God, you have to think about, what the implications of these things are. So
Let me briefly increase your headache, as you mentioned.
Good. I appreciate that.
Is that if God in metaphysical time creates T1 in world time, then God's existing in T1 in world time makes God metaphysical time coincident with world time, and it makes whatever time is later than the time in God's time, that is God's creation of T1 in world time, it makes that time later than that metaphysical time. And since that metaphysical time is in world time, so the later time is also coincident with the later world time.
I think the argument is internally consistent, but I disagree with the word coincident. I don't think if you allow me to posit different kinds of times, a God time and a world time, I don't think that you can use the word coincident to say that any event in world time is coincident with an event in God time. I won't let you do that, because what I would say is that all the events in world time are coincident with one event in God time. Now I'm giving you a headache.
Okay, no, actually, you're giving me a good example of a contradiction, which is you have one time.
At least I'm good at something.
You have one time in God's time, and yet it's simultaneous with a number of times that are not simultaneous with each other. So you have the contradiction that there's one time series that's simultaneous with times that are not simultaneous with each other in another time series.
Simultaneous is only a relative word within its own context. You cannot deal with simultaneity by comparing these two different existential concepts of time. You can deal with simultaneity within world time. I'm not sure what you do with God time, but you cannot say there's any simultaneity. But you are right. You did increase my headache.
Well, I could increase it more, but I'll give you a break.